huge moon and a clear sky lit up the ground, and the air was crisp and cool. Johnny crossed the street to Emmy's house and rapped on the door. Emmy opened it. Her hair was in pigtails, and as she often wore it, and she sported a blue and white gingham dress. She had a picnic basket in her hand and silver-pointed shoes on her feet. "Trick or treat, Dorothy," Johnny said. Emmy giggled. "Welcome to Kansas, Moses," she replied. "Oh, and you brought Toto, too." She bent down to pick up Macduff's head. "Don't worry, I'll protect you from the Wicked Witch." Macduff yawned and scratched. You look great," Johnny stated. "Just like I imagined, Dorothy, from the book." "Thanks. I'd like to say you look like the Moses I imagined, but to be honest, you kind of look like a cross between a clown and a frog." Johnny scowled. "I wasn't counting on the green tint showing up in the dark," he admitted. "But it could be how Moses really looked. Who's to say?" Emmy wrinkled her nose. "One thing's for sure. I'm not going to nickname you Moses." She paused, then smugly added, "Personally, I still like Wit." Johnny rolled his eyes. "Keep trying," he said. "So what are you doing here anyway?" Emmy asked. "The party isn't until 9. Johnny smiled broadly through his cotton ball beard. "You won't believe this, but my dad said I can trick or treat tonight." "What? Are you kidding? How did you pull that off?" "Refraction." She looked confused. "You don't remember?" he asked. "The conversation you and I had this morning? You asked me how to make something solid look as though it bent." Emmy nodded. "Oh, you said something about bending light through a prism or something. Right. So I took your advice. We were talking about the phrases you asked him to translate." "You mean the ones you told me to ask him to translate?" Johnny shrugged. "Yeah, anyway, I admitted that. They were for me. And, of course, he already knew, because he knows everything, but that led into a bigger discussion about more important things." "What things?" "Don't interrupt. So, when I asked him about trick-or-treating, my father, the unbendable object, appeared to actually bend when he saw that tonight was just a small thing compared to the big thing that bent his, well, light. Refraction. Great idea, Emmy." Emmy stared at him blankly. "What in the world are you talking about?" Johnny laughed. Johnny sighed, then laughed. "Nothing. Let's go trick-or-treating before Fiona changes my dad's mind." Chapter 10. Johnny and Emmy stopped at a few houses on the way to Professor Mangle's, where they would join forces with Steve and Paul. The first house handed out apples, drawing a frown from Emmy. Problem? He asked as they walked away. "Yeah," she replied with a scowl. "The whole point of trick-or-treating is to get candy, not fruit." "Then you probably want to stay away from my place," Johnny joked. The next two houses were better. The first gave them each a few pieces of taffy, and the second handed out peppermint sticks. There were more homes where they could have stopped, but Johnny felt they had gotten a late start and hurried them along toward the Mangle house instead. "So who are these boys, anyway?" Emmy asked as they hiked past the Granville grounds, weaving through an assortment of costumed pirates, ghosts, and a few Charlie Chaplin little tramps, and one kid dressed like King Kong. "Some fellas I met in the woods a few days back," Johnny replies. "Steve and his younger brother, Paul. They're really nice." He stopped then suddenly and turned to her. I should warn you, though. Steve is in a wheelchair." "Why?" "He has some illness. I don't know what it is, so we may have to push him around, okay?" Emmy nodded. "It's okay." A short while later, they arrived at the Mangle home, a tan American Foursquare style house. Styled home with dormer windows and a small porch with 2 blocks from the fence line and the Granville house. In fact, it was just down the street from the break of the fence where Milo Knox had parked his car when he kidnapped them. After they had told him about the location of the Confederate gold, rose bushes lined the front of the house, their blooms all spent for the year. The porch swing swayed lazily in the gentle evening breeze. A ramp covered the steps, and Johnny and Emmy walked up it to the front door. Several moths flitted about the porch light, unconcerned by their presence. Johnny tapped the door knocker twice, and within a few seconds, the front door opened. A woman of slight build stood on the other side. Her red hair was elaborately coiffed, and she wore a gray floral patterned dress and high heels, and was smoking a cigarette. Benny Goodman played in the background on the radio. "Aren't you gonna say it?" the woman asked hoarsely. Johnny wasn't sure what she meant. "Ma'am, I believe trick or treat is the usual phrase," she clarified. "Oh, actually we're here for Steve and Paul. I'm John Whitaker, and this is Emily Capello. Professor Mangle said I should stop by, and we could all go trick-or-treating together." "I see," she said. "My husband did say something about that. Wait a moment, please." She turned and called the boys, who hollered back that they were just about ready. Johnny and Emmy stood outside awkwardly. Mrs. Mangle turned back and studied him, taking a puff of her cigarette. She looked at him so long without saying anything, and he began to feel uncomfortable. Finally, she exhaled a small cloud of smoke and said, "You appear to be glowing. You supposed to be a clown?" "No, ma'am. Moses, coming down from the mountain." She looked confused. "The Bible says he was radiant, glowing." "Oh." She turned to Emmy. "How about you, young lady?" the woman asked, Emmy. I'm Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz. And where's Toto? She asked Johnny, sniffing around the trees. Another awkward pause hung in the air until Johnny finally remembered something. Ma'am, Professor Mangle promised to load our pillowcases up when we came by. He smiled hopefully and held out his pillowcase, elbowing Emmy in the process. She quickly held out hers as well. The woman scowled at them. Oh, did he? He did he? Well, he's not here at the moment, so the normal dole will have to do. She dropped one piece of hard candy into each of the mostly empty pillowcases. Emmy looked in her case, sneered, and was just about to say something when Johnny cut her off. Thank you, ma'am. Emmy glared at him, and he frowned at her and jerked his head toward the woman. Yes, Emmy said so sweetly. Thank you ever so much. Finally, Paul and Steve arrived at the door. Paul pushing Steve in the wheelchair. Paul was dressed in cowboy gear, complete with hat and vest, chaps, and bandana. His 6 shooters were at his side, and a tin star adorned his vest. The only thing betraying his costume were the Keds sneakers on his feet, and the fact that he had used a marker to draw eyebrows back on his face. He had also used it to draw a mustache on his upper lip. Johnny gave Steve the once-over and said, "Where's your costume?" "I've got it on," Steve insisted. "Can't you tell? I'm Clark Gable. So handsome, I make the women swoon." He grinned mischievously. Johnny chortled. More like the Cheshire Cat from Alice in Wonderland. Emily scoffed. She's gonna fit right in. Johnny introduced Emmy to the boys, and then, after promises to Mrs. Mangle that they would be home before it got too late, the group departed. They quickly made their way back into the more populated section of town, which wasn't much more crowded. Providence consisted of a drugstore, a small grocery store, a church, a post office, a barber who also served as an emergency dentist, a diner, and a one-man newspaper. Providence Standard. Town hall, a public library, a sheriff's station with 2 deputies, one part-time, Brookhaven Public School, and about 970 residents in the town, with several hundred more living in the surrounding hills and farms and forests. In some respect, the area hadn't recovered fully from the Civil War, adding to the problem. Many businesses had failed since the beginning of the Great Depression, resulting in multiple families immigrating to what they hoped would be greener pastures. Those who stayed had found work in one of the factories or the mills in Durham or Raylan, or had tried to.
But that too was short-lived. Many of the larger businesses had shut their doors in the years that followed as well. That being the case, it didn't take a great deal of time to canvass most of the residents in the town. Fully half the houses were unlit, a signal that those within either didn't observe the holiday or couldn't pay their utility bills, which meant they also couldn't afford any treats either way. The rambunctious kids of the area were happy for those who welcomed the costume peddlers, supplied them with treats, and those who didn't would awaken tomorrow to discover their windows had been
egged or soaped over. Johnny didn't observe that tradition. He had promised his father he wouldn't cause mischief. He also didn't want to get into trouble and draw more attention to himself. Steve and Paul, on the other hand, brought eggs and a bar of soap along with them. Steve couldn't carry out the tricks. He didn't have enough strength, but Paul did. He also had a good arm. As they rounded into Hyder Street, they almost literally ran into Wilson Knox and Artie Moore, Johnny and Emmy's nemesis in the Confederate Gold Mystery. Both Wilson and Artie were obnoxious bullies before the conclusion of the mystery took them down a notch or two. But now that Johnny and Emmy's celebrity was starting to fade, Wilson and Artie were slowly returning to their old selves. Both were bigger than Johnny, but they were wary of him since they knew he was proficient in karate and had taught Emmy a few moves as well. That didn't stop their mouths from flapping, however.
"Well, look who it is," said Wilson. "Sherlock, the hero, and his sidekick, Watkins."
"Yeah, Watkins,"
Artie echoed.
"That's Watson, you dunce,"
Emmy said with a scowl.
Artie frowned, but Wilson chuckled like it matters. Wilson replied. "So what are you supposed to be, Whitaker? A giant furry glowing pickle?" Artie roared. "Pickle?" Johnny sighed and said, "No, I'm Moses. When he came down from the mountain after receiving the 10 Commandments." "Oh, yeah?" Wilson nodded, smirking. "'Cause he was supposed to be radiant, right?" Johnny and Emmy looked at each other and blinked, then looked back at Wilson. "You got that?" asked Emmy. "You know the Bible?" asked Johnny. "Course I did. And of course I do," he said indignantly to each of them in turn. "Well, some of it, at least." Emmy shook her head. "Well, I have to say, you certainly are full of surprises, Wilson." "Oh, Wilson Knox is a lot deeper than you could possibly know," he said, cocking his head to one side flirtatiously. A simple curling of his lips. Emmy suddenly looked very uncomfortable, as if she had just bitten into something really bitter. Johnny thought he might really turn green. from nausea. Hey now, Artie said. This kid's got the right idea. He pushed past Emmy and blocked Steve's wheelchair. Dressing up like a cripple. You probably took a big haul, Lessie. He grabbed Steve's pillowcase off his lap and peered inside. Hey! Steve yelped. Hey! Steve yelped. Paul gulped and stepped back. Johnny sprang forward. Give it back, Artie! He demanded. Easy now. I just wanted to see whether your friend here got any good stuff. He jostled the sack. Sure feels hefty. Now, Artie. Okay. The Brewster smirked and tossed the bag back on Steve's lap. I'm gonna try your outfit next year, kid. It's not an outfit, you pinhead! Emmy explained. Artie looked at each of their faces confused. You mean he's really... He stopped, swallowed hard, and turned back to Steve. I didn't mean nothing. Just go! Johnny barked, jaw clenched. Wilson grabbed Artie's arm. Come on, let's get out of here, Wilson urged. He pulled Artie away, and they both walked down the street. Emmy shook with rage. Johnny turned to Steve, concerned. Don't pay him any mind, Johnny said. He tries to act big and by making others feel small. Steve shrugged, waving it off. It's no big deal. You gotta admit it, I do have more candy than the rest of you. Works every year. He smiled, but Johnny could see sadness in his eyes. They're a couple of charmers, aren't they? Steve added. Wilson Knox is a wet sock, Emmy said. And that Artie, what a muttonhead. Those two make me so angry. The bigger one seems kind of sweet on you, said Steve with a grin. Emmy spun on him. What? Don't make me puke! Steve laughed. Johnny snickered, and even Paul grinned. A smile slowly broke across Emmy's face. Soon they were all laughing as they moved down the block toward the next row of houses. When the laughter subsided, Steve looked at Johnny and Emmy and said, So, you gonna ask me? Ask you what? Said Johnny. Why I can't walk. Johnny and Emmy exchanged glances, and Johnny shrugged. Oh, come on. Steve said, I know you want to. So, why can't you walk? Emmy asked softly. I've never walked. Emmy's jaw dropped. Never? Not even as a baby? Paul chimed in. That's how they found out what he was. What do you have? Johnny asked. Muscular dystrophy, Steve answered, even tossing a piece of candy corn in his mouth.
I've never heard of it,
Emmy said, leaning back.
Is it a disease?
I'm not contagious, if that's what you're worried about, Steve said.
I'm not worried at all,
Emmy said. Steve looked at her skeptically, then smiled. You two are the only ones in town who haven't avoided me. Or who only want to know about what's wrong with me, and if it's catching. That's one reason I took you. That's one reason I took to you when we were down by the river, he said to Johnny. You didn't bring it up at all. To be honest, it never crossed my mind, Johnny said. They walked by one dark house, then another.
I really didn't think you were,
Emmy said in a small voice,
contagious. I mean, I was just wondering whether the doctors could cure it.
Steve searched for a different confection and pulled out a stick of blackjack gum, which he unwrapped and plopped in his mouth. I better eat as much of this as I can before I get home. My mom will only let us have a few pieces a day, he said, chewing. There's no cure, Steve finally answered. My muscles will just get weaker and weaker. I'll have more trouble breathing, and if some other sickness like pneumonia doesn't take me, my heart will eventually give out. No one said anything for a long moment. Steve reached back into his sack and fished out another stick of blackjack gum. Gum? He offered.
But why?
Emmy asked. 'Cause it's a good chew.
No, I mean, why are your heart and lungs affected by this disease?
Your lungs and your heart are muscles too, Emmy, Johnny said quietly. Emmy took a piece of gum Steve held up, unwrapped it, placed it in her mouth, and started to chew. They all walked in silence. Johnny certainly didn't know what to say. That Steve probably hadn't heard it a million times before. By the time they made the circuit and rounded onto Brewster Lane, everyone's pillowcase was about half full. They would have been even fuller, but all four of them had eaten enough to make their stomachs more than queasy. They headed back toward Steve and Paul's home, past the water tower and the old Granville place. Johnny observed the water tower that they had played such an important role during the first few weeks in town. It was dark, but when he looked hard, he could just make out his unfinished experiment to re-energizing an old car battery via lightning. The wire still dangling from the top of the tower. He still thought it was an idea worth pursuing, but he certainly didn't want to deal with his father's ire again. According to Deputy Miller, who had helped him
off the tower. The old Granville house and the property next to it had been abandoned for years. The grounds were thick with overgrown vegetation, and the old sanctuary surrounded by the concrete and wrought iron fence, though set back away from the road. The house itself was still visible from the street, a looming, imposing structure with dozens of broken windows and in desperate need of a new coat of paint. Part of the mystery of the Confederate gold took place on those grounds, and though the closest Johnny had gotten to the house was a nest of trees called Lover's Circle, he loved the architecture of the place. From its multiple spires to its ornate gables and eaves hanging over the wraparound porch, it seemed like a building you could explore inside forever and always find a new surprise. Then he saw it. It was brief but unmistakable there. A light inside on whatever must be the third floor. He saw it, a flicker through the dormer window. A candle, a small flashlight. "Did you guys see that?" he asked. Emmy had. "Yeah, some kids must be goofing off in there." "Probably Wilson and Artie." Johnny shook his head. "After what happened to Artie last time, I doubt he'll ever come back here." "Why? What happened?" asked Paul. "It's not important," Johnny answered. A big grin broke across Steve's face. "Let's sneak up there and scare 'em." Dad told us to play out of the stays," Paul admonished, pushing the wheelchair a bit faster as though trying to break an invisible gravitational pull of temptation. "Hold it," Steve commanded. The wheelchair came to a halt. "Dad doesn't want us exploring in there 'cause he has no imagination." "But it's perfect, Johnny. If you pulled that mop off your head and lost the 10 Commandments, you'll be a textbook ghost. We could scare the pants off of them." It took a bit of convincing, but the kids agreed to go along with the prank. Only Macduff refused. No matter how much they coaxed, he stayed put. "He's the only one of us with any sense," said Emmy. They left the pup behind and made their way to the house as deftly as possible. Johnny removed his hair mop, set down his staff and the tablets at the front gate, and crept to the porch of the mansion. Johnny began to mount the stairs when Steve urgently whispered, "Wait!" Johnny stopped. "What?" "I'm coming too. It was my idea. Besides, I can make bad sounds with my cheeks," he demonstrated, fluttering his jowls rapidly. Everybody stifled a laugh, though Emmy snorted. "That's great," Johnny whispered. "Paul, grab one side of the wheelchair while I get the other. Emmy, steady back." Paul lamented softly. "I'm gonna get in so much. I'm gonna get in more trouble for this."
On the count of 3, they lifted, and with seconds, they were all on the porch. Emmy pushed Steve, and Paul let her. At least I can deny that much, Steve muttered. They paused at the door. Steve gave everyone their instructions. Johnny, walk really slow and wave your arms around like you're a little crazy. Paul, moan and ooh and stuff.
That always sounds spooky.
Emmy, when I nod to you, let out a big scream. I'll do the bat sound effects. He paused, a wide grin covering his face. Ready? They all nodded except Paul. Emmy nudged him. What's wrong? You scared? Not of this house, he moaned. Of my parents. They don't have the heart to punish Steve, so they give me an extra dose. He rubbed the seat of his pants. I can almost feel it already. Well, if you're already feeling the punishment, you might as well do the crime, Johnny quipped. Steve snickered. You're my kind of guy. He said, lead on. Johnny nodded and grabbed the handle on the door. He and his companions walked through it into the dark, ramshackle house, unaware of the adventure that awaits.